February 1400. Pontefract Castle sits under a hard northern sky, its thick walls holding damp cold like a sponge. In a guarded chamber, Richard I of England is fading, not from age or a battlefield wound, but from a quiet decision made by men who now hold power. Meals arrive smaller than they should. The firewood is rationed. The servants, who once bowed deeply, now avoid his eyes. Richard begins to understand that in medieval politics you did not always need a sword to end a reign. Sometimes all it took was a locked door, a controlled routine, and the slow removal of comfort until a crown felt like a memory. This is the final act in a life that began in ceremony and ended in confinement, a reminder that trust could be the most expensive luxury in England. Even the sounds of the castle feel different now. Footsteps, measured keys, turning a distant bell marking prayers he can no longer join. For a king raised to believe he was chosen by God, the loss of agency is its own kind of punishment because it tells him that the world has moved on without asking his leave. Welcome to Medieval Spirits. Tonight, we step into a story about a boy who inherited a crown, a man who tried to rule with absolute certainty, and the rivals who decided the safest solution was to make him vanish from the stage of history. If you enjoy calm, detailed history that goes beyond legends and easy villains, consider liking the video and subscribing. It helps us keep telling these complicated human stories. We will trace Richard from childhood to coronation, from crisis to confidence, and finally to the moment when politics stopped being speeches and became silence. Along the way, you will see how personal grief, public fear, and noble ambition can pull a kingdom apart without a single trumpet sounding. This is England at the end of the 14th century, a place where law, tradition, and force overlap, and where a ruler's personality can tip the balance between peace and crisis. Our goal is not to sensationalize Richard's end, but to understand how it became possible. Richard was born in Bordeaux in 1367, far from Westminster, and for a time he was not expected to be king. He was the younger son of Edward the Black Prince, the celebrated commander of the 100 Years' War. Richard's early years were shaped by privilege and careful education rather than training for rule. That changed when his older brother Edward of Angoulême died in 1371, suddenly placing the weight of succession on a child still learning his letters. Not long after, the Black Prince began to fail from a long illness, and Richard watched the strongest figure in his world grow weaker. In a household full of banners and duty, the lessons were clear: greatness could disappear, and the future could shift overnight. Those early losses placed Richard under the gaze of powerful relatives, especially his uncle's men who had their own ideas about what England needed. From the start, Richard's life was shaped by other people's expectations, and that pressure would later collide with his own desire to be obeyed. Through the 1370s, the Black Prince's decline became the backdrop of Richard's childhood. When the prince died in 1376, Richard was 9, and the adults around him became the architects of his future uncle's counselors, household officers, and ambitious nobles who understood that a child king created openings. A year later, Edward I died after a long reign, and 10-year-old Richard was crowned in 1377. Westminster glowed with pageantry, but behind the gold cloth and incense was a stark reality. England now belonged to a boy who needed guidance in a world where guidance often came with strings attached. Regency government was necessary, but it also meant Richard grew up seeing decisions made around him, sometimes in his name, sometimes in spite of him. That experience can foster patience, or it can foster a hunger to take control the moment one is able. Richard's household became a school and observation watch: who sits closest, who speaks first, who leaves last. He learned that politics was not only policy but posture, and that adults could smile warmly while competing behind the scenes. A council governed in Richard's name, with John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster, as the most influential figure. England was strained by the continuing war with France and by the cost of defending coasts, paying soldiers, and maintaining the prestige of the crown. Taxes landed hard on towns and villages already living close to the edge. Disputes over labor and wages simmered after years of hardship and disease. People began to talk about fairness in a new way, not as lofty philosophy, but as daily survival. Richard, still young, learned early that a king could be adored in ceremony and doubted in the marketplace on the same day. The royal household learned to measure popularity the way a sailor measures wind, not by what is said in a chapel, but by what is whispered at a tavern door. In such an environment, a young king could learn either humility or defensiveness, and Richard leaned toward defensiveness. That tension erupted in 1381 in the rising we call the Peasants' Revolt. Richard was 14 when crowds surged into London, attacked symbols of authority, and forced the government to react in public view. He met the rebels at Smithfield and spoke with a confidence that surprised his elders. When Wat Tyler was killed during the confrontation, Richard seized the moment, telling the crowd he would be their leader and urging them to disperse. Later, once the immediate danger passed, the revolt was suppressed and order restored. The young king absorbed a lasting lesson. Fear could be used as a tool, and a single day of chaos could shape a lifetime of decisions. To some, his courage at Smithfield looked like proof that the boy would become a strong ruler. To others, the aftermath showed he would not hesitate to use harsh measures when he felt cornered. Both readings contained a piece of truth, and Richard carried them into adulthood. The revolt did not make Richard a tyrant overnight, but it did change how he saw his responsibilities and his risks. He became more alert to danger, more sensitive to criticism, and more convinced that a king must never appear weak. Over time, that caution hardened into suspicion. He spoke often of royal prerogative and divine right, and he grew impatient with challenges, as if disagreement itself were disloyalty. Advisors who offered blunt counsel found themselves pushed aside, while those who praised him gained access. In a court built on proximity, access became power, and power began to concentrate around the king's mood rather than the kingdom's needs. He also began to cultivate a sense of theatrical authority, expecting deference, not only in council but in everyday interactions. When a ruler makes respect a requirement rather than a result, the people around him often learn to perform loyalty rather than feel it. Richard's court developed a refined style. He favored poets, musicians, careful ritual, and the visual language of kingship. He wanted the crown to feel magnificent, not merely powerful. Many nobles, however, expected a king who shared their military values and their hardships. They looked at Richard's interests with uncertainty, and they resented the money spent on display when taxes were high. At the same time, Richard could be slow to forgive. A slight might be remembered for years, and answered later with a legal decision that removed land office or influence, delivered with the cold neatness of official seals. The problem was not culture itself, but the way culture became a substitute for consensus. If the court looked splendid enough, Richard hoped doubts would fall silent. Yet, resentment does not dissolve in candlelight, and noble families kept careful mental ledgers of every slight and every favor. In 1382, Richard married Anne of Bohemia. The match was arranged for diplomacy, yet it became a genuine partnership. Anne was thoughtful and tactful, and she often softened the king's sharper instincts, encouraging patience where he might have chosen punishment. During the 1380s and early 1390s, the court felt steadier and the kingdom enjoyed stretches of calm. Chroniclers noticed that Richard seemed more balanced with Anne beside him, as if her presence gave him an emotional anchor. For a ruler shaped by early losses, that kind of steady companionship mattered more than any treaty. Anne's influence also helped Richard present himself as a peacemaker at moments when the country was tired of war taxes. For many subjects, The queen was an image of steadiness, and her presence gave the reign a softer rhythm that Richard alone struggled to maintain. Anne also helped connect England to wider European networks of trade and culture. Her household drew scholars and artists, and the court became a place where learning mattered alongside chivalry. This did not erase political conflict, but it gave Richard's reign a gentler public face and offered him someone he trusted. That trust mattered because Richard's instincts often pulled him toward isolation, and isolation is dangerous for any ruler. A king who hears only his own household can begin to confuse private feeling with public policy, and a kingdom can be ruled by emotion disguised as certainty. The distance between king and nobility can be bridged by trust, by shared campaigns, or by steady consultation. Richard increasingly chose ceremony over consultation, and in the long run, ceremony could not do the work of compromise. In 1394, Anne died suddenly, likely from one of the fevers that returned again and again to medieval towns and palaces. Richard's grief was deep and public. He withdrew, and the careful balance Anne had helped maintain began to slip away. The atmosphere at court grew tense. Richard seemed to reach for control in small matters, appearances, schedules, ceremonies, as if order could replace the stability he had lost. Nobles who had tolerated his preferences while Anne lived now watched him more closely, unsure whether the king was mourning or hardening. Richard's grief also carried a practical consequence. He leaned more heavily on the voices that soothed him, and those voices were not always the wisest. The court became less a forum and more a mirror, reflecting Richard's feelings back to him as if they were policy. 2 years later, Richard entered a second marriage with Isabella of Valois, the young daughter of the French king, as part of a treaty meant to reduce conflict with France. The match was strategic, but it offered no companionship and no immediate hope of an heir. Many English subjects disliked the sense that hard-won advantages abroad were being traded away for peace. In a kingdom that valued tradition, the image of a grown king with a very young bride raised uncomfortable questions about judgment. It also reminded everyone that the succession was still uncertain, and uncertainty is the soil where rival claims grow quickly. The peace with France had real benefits, but it also asked England to accept a new direction without broad agreement. When a king changes course abruptly, he must bring people with him. Richard instead expected obedience, and expectation is not the same as support. This second marriage revealed a larger problem. Richard was increasingly distant from the institutions that had supported earlier kings. He treated Parliament more as a hurdle than a partner, and he preferred rule by decree when he felt challenged. Noble families who had gained wealth and pride through campaigns against France believed their interests were being overlooked. Meanwhile, the question of succession remained unsettled, and in uncertain successions, ambition always finds room to breathe. Richard's confidence in his own authority may have felt like strength to him, but to many others it looked like a king testing how far he could bend custom without breaking it. He also began to use legal mechanisms in more aggressive ways, turning fines, forfeitures, and court procedures into tools of discipline. To Richard, this was governance. To his opponents, it felt like punishment wearing official clothing. Richard also relied heavily on favorites, younger courtiers who rose quickly through royal attention. Men such as Robert de Vere and Michael de la Pole benefited from this closeness, receiving titles and offices that older nobles believed should have been earned through long service. Favoritism was common in medieval courts, but the pace and scale of reward in Richard's reign created resentment. Experienced lords felt excluded from decisions. They interpreted the king's generosity as proof that government had become personal, a household matter, rather than a national one. Every grant of land, every appointment, every public honor became another reason for old families to believe the king was rewriting the rules in front of them. The rise of favorites also created a rumor mill. that never rested because secrecy always invites imagination. Even ordinary administrative decisions were interpreted through the question of who had the king's ear that week. As resentment spread, conversations turned into plans. Great households hosted quiet meetings where grievances were listed and alliances tested. The Lord's appellant, powerful nobles who believed the king's inner circle threatened stability, began organizing formal opposition. Their challenge was political and cultural. They wanted a king who listened, shared burdens, and respected the established balance between crown and aristocracy. Richard saw their pressure as a personal challenge to his authority. From his perspective, to yield would be to admit weakness. From theirs, to resist was to risk a future where property and law depended on the king's changing mood. The conflict produced moments of open confrontation in Parliament and in the royal courts, as well as quieter moments where men chose sides with a handshake. Once those lines were drawn, reconciliation required extraordinary restraint, and restraint was not Richard's strongest habit. Into this uneasy landscape stepped Henry Bolingbroke, a man with wealth, military experience, and a reputation for competence. Henry was the son of John of Gaunt, and he had fought abroad and spoken the language of leadership that many nobles admired. To Richard, that popularity looked like a shadow over the throne. Medieval kings had reason to fear rivals, but Richard's suspicion became his default setting, and that made compromise harder. When he acted as if removing threats mattered more than healing divisions, and that approach often creates the very danger it hopes to prevent. Henry was not only a rival by blood, but a symbol of the kind of king many nobles thought they wanted: active, martial, and familiar with their world. That contrast made Richard feel exposed, and exposed rulers often strike first. The breaking point came in 1398 during a dispute between Henry Bolingbroke and Thomas Mowbray, Duke of Norfolk. Accusations of dangerous talk and possible treason swirled between them, and they requested trial by combat, a ritual that carried deep meaning in medieval society. Richard allowed preparations, then stopped the duel at the last moment and exiled both men. He may have hoped to prevent a clear victor from gaining too much prestige, yet the decision made the king appear uncertain and controlling at once. Henry received a long exile that removed him from English political life in his prime. To many observers, it felt like the king was managing rivals not through law but through distance, sending problems away rather than resolving them. To Henry and his supporters, the exile looked less like neutral peacekeeping and more like the king controlling outcomes to protect himself. It weakened confidence in the fairness of royal judgment, which was a dangerous thing in a society that relied on hierarchy to function. Exile might have cooled the situation if Richard had acted with restraint afterward. Instead, his next choice convinced many that law and property were no longer safe. When John of Gaunt died in February 1399, custom and expectation said Henry should inherit the great Lancastrian estates. Richard seized them for the crown. To many nobles, this was not merely a family dispute. It looked like a signal that any inheritance could be taken if the king felt threatened. Even lords who disliked Henry began to worry about their own sons, their own wills, their own promises. And once fear spreads among the powerful, it moves faster than any army. This single act did more to unite Richard's critics than a dozen speeches could have done. A noble might tolerate a king's vanity, but few would tolerate insecurity about inheritance, because inheritance was the backbone of their world. In the summer of 1399, Richard left England for a campaign in Ireland. The expedition had strategic reasons, but it removed the king at the worst moment, taking key forces and leaving the government exposed. Henry Bolingbroke returned while Richard was away, publicly claiming he sought only his inheritance and the restoration of lawful rights. Many listened because they wanted stability and a return to predictable law. Support gathered quickly. Towns opened gates. Nobles weighed their options and chose the side that felt safer for their families and estates. What began as an argument about property soon looked like a transfer of power carried forward by momentum and shared frustration. Henry's return was careful and strategic, and it benefited from the speed of medieval rumor. By the time Richard's loyalists understood the scale of the shift had already happened because allegiance can change quickly when people believe change will protect them. When Richard returned from Ireland, he found a different kingdom. His network of support was thinner, and the fear he had relied on was not enough to rebuild loyalty in time. The decisive confrontation took place at Flint Castle in Wales. Henry demanded that Richard abdicate. The offer included the appearance of mercy, a promise of comfortable retirement, but it carried an unspoken warning. Richard stepped down, and Henry became Henry IV. The change was wrapped in legal language petitions and formal ceremonies because successful usurpations often dressed themselves in paperwork. To the public, it was framed as restoration. To Richard, it was the end of everything he believed about divine appointment. Richard's abdication was not only a personal fall, but a constitutional moment because it raised questions about whether kingship was truly fixed by blood or could be justified by performance. Those questions would echo for generations long after the ink on the documents had dried. Richard was taken into custody first to the Tower of London and later to Pontefract Castle. At the beginning, his confinement was controlled but not openly brutal. Over time, the atmosphere shifted. Servants changed. Routines tightened. Meals arrived smaller and less frequent. At first, it could be dismissed as carelessness, then as deliberate inconvenience, and finally as a message: the former king's needs no longer mattered. In the quiet of his chamber, hunger became a clock marking days that no longer belonged to him. The most unsettling part was not the cold, but the certainty that help would not come, because the people who once owed him loyalty now owed it elsewhere. Richard could still hope that supporters might rally or that negotiations might improve his situation. As food and warmth diminished, hope narrowed. The castle did not need to shout its message. The routine itself delivered it. A slow, death-reduced risk for the new regime. A public execution could create sympathy and encourage rebellion, while a quiet decline behind castle walls could be explained as illness. As weeks passed, Richard's strength ebbed. His body thinned, his voice weakened, and his attention wandered. The mind struggles when the body is not sustained, and even a proud spirit can sink into exhaustion. Later chroniclers described him as gaunt and worn, a striking contrast to the carefully presented monarch who once valued elegance and ceremony. Whether every detail of the withholding can be proven, the larger truth remains: Richard's enemies wanted him gone, and they wanted the method to leave as little controversy as possible. A slow removal also allowed different factions to tell different stories later, depending on what suited them. That ambiguity is part of why Richard's final days remain debated, yet the political logic behind keeping him from returning to power is clear. Richard died at Pontefract Castle on February 14, 1400. Official statements suggested natural causes, yet many contemporaries believed he had been deliberately starved. His body was later displayed in a public procession from the north to London, a carefully staged act meant to quiet rumors and discourage uprisings. Even death in medieval politics could be arranged as theater. The public needed to see the end with their own eyes so that the story could be controlled before other stories took root. In that procession, grief and calculation walked side by side because the death of a king was never only personal. It was always a political event shaped to serve whoever remained standing. For Henry, IV legitimacy had to be reinforced again and again, not only with proclamations, but with visible proof that the old king could not return. In that sense, the procession was as much about the living as it was about the dead. Richard's final chapter reminds us that medieval monarchy was never only crowns and ceremony. It was also fragile agreements, shifting alliances, and the constant fear of being replaced. His reign began with bright pageantry around a child king, and ended with quiet absence behind stone walls, leaving England to carry the consequences into a new era of conflict. When we look back, Richard is not only a warning about pride or paranoia, he is also a reminder that power depends on trust, and trust was always in short supply. In the cold rooms of Pontefract, a dynasty did not end with a trumpet or a battle cry, but with a closing door and the slow turning of time toward a new king, a new court, and new troubles waiting just beyond the next winter. If you step back, the tragedy is not only that Richard lost his throne, but that he never found a stable way to share authority with the people who could either support him or remove him. His story sits at the crossroads of medieval kingship and later conflicts, a quiet warning carved into stone and memory. And when we remember him today, it can help to hold two truths at once. Richard could be proud and punitive, yet he was also a product of early loss and relentless pressure. Understanding that complexity does not excuse his mistakes, but it does make the history feel human rather than distant.